bit late. We were held up in calendar just a little bit longer than expected. So the first item on the agenda, are there any bill introductions this morning? All right, seeing none, we're going to go ahead and start on the informational briefings, first by the Kansas Department of Agriculture and then in regards to the water plan. So first I would ask that Kelsey Olson, the Deputy Secretary for the Department of Agriculture, give us a briefing on the agriculture industry in the state of Kansas. Kelsey.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here before you today. I serve as the Deputy Secretary of the Kansas Department of Agriculture and are excited to try and provide you an update of where we are in the Kansas agriculture. So just a little bit of background. Kansas agriculture is the state's largest economy. We've got 73 different agriculture, food, and food processing sectors that combine for a direct economic input of $61.89 billion in Kansas. Each year, our Kansas marketing team puts together our economic outlook reports. I've included the statewide outlook report as one of the addendums to my presentation today. You can reference that, but we also put together county by county reports as well. So for all 105 counties, we have a report that you can find either on our website or by request that talks about what the county's economic inputs are in regards to agriculture. That's just one of the things that we do. Agriculture is such a large industry. We want to make sure everyone has the right information about the industry as a whole. So certainly our farmers and ranchers support and drive the state's economy, and we have a significant portion of the U.S. ag marketing value comes from our state. Kansas ranks 7th in total ag value production, much of that coming from the southwest corner of Kansas when you think of our beef cattle industry. This is all relevant because as we look forward, the United Nations are looking at the world's population to nearly double by 2050. And in order to feed those people, they're going to need to have food. Our Kansas producers are very effective and efficient at producing food, growing food, and we will stand ready for that challenge. Just this week, President Trump announced tariffs to our largest trading partners, Mexico, Canada, and China. They went into effect on Tuesday. This is primarily noteworthy because, as I mentioned, Kansas is a large producer. We rank 7th. Many of our dollars that our producers receive come from ag exports. We produce more in Kansas than what our consumers are able to consume, and so our exports are a critical function of our ag market. Approximately 1/3 of Kansas's exports as a whole come from food and agriculture. That puts us in right at about $4.6 billion each year. There's a little chart there on my testimony. You can see our top 10 products that are exported on an annual basis, the first being meat and edible offal. I'm going to call that one out. You might wonder what edible offal is, right? So when we think meat, we talk about steaks in our roasts and what we regularly consume. There are a lot of parts of that beef animal that are consumed in other cultures. So think the oxtail, think about the organs, the heart. Those are all consumed, the tongue even. We typically don't consume many of them in the state or in the country, but those products are desirable by our trading partners. So those products are exported. In our terms, we call them edible offal. Others call them delicacies in some countries. But it's that export market that drives that price. Right now, our beef cattle prices are as strong as we've seen. Very high beef markets. Prior to this surge, we could safely and confidently say that about $400 per market animal was being brought in because of the export market. Today, that's probably gone up because while steak prices have gone up slightly, we have not seen that vastly hit our grocery stores yet, but it's being driven by that value overseas. There's also, we do report create an ag export every year report on that. We have not finalized the 2024 report. However, I have provided the 2023 report that we produced last year as reference. In there, you're going to see our top 10 countries that we produce or export products to. And in 2023, we exported products to more than 99 countries, or right at 99 countries, excuse me, and 80%, though, of our exports went to our top 5 export countries: Mexico, Japan, Canada, and South Korea. At the agency, we have been strong advocates for trade agreements. Trade policy is a key component. There's about 20 different trade agreements that the U.S. has with different trading partners. And I would point out, during President Trump's first term, he did impose some tariffs initially on China and helped establish the Chinese Phase 1 agreement of U.S. trade policy. That trade policy had a direct impact on our Kansas exports. We saw China go from number 5 up to number 2 or 3, depending on the year. We noted an increase, certainly, in our exports. So tariffs can be used in the short term, can make an impact. However, if they stay in place for long terms, there are real risks to our Kansas farmers and ranchers. That's just how the tariff situation works. We continue to be a member of many trade organizations that promote market access, market entry programs, and that not only support our farmers and ranchers, but also our agribusinesses. Food Export Midwest is an organization that we are members of that provide resources to companies who want to take their products and export. These are not large, major companies that you might think of. One of our success stories in Kansas has been Grandpa's Best, which is a hay company in Scandia. They have had much success by exporting, honestly, the leftovers from their hay business. They package in small containers and export for pet food as a pet industry. They have been immensely successful, and we've worked with them and others through our Food Export Midwest to find markets that are suitable for their products, and as well as help make those connections with the buyers in the countries. That's partnerships with our trade companies that we partner with, as well as with the USDA and their Foreign Ag Service, which help work on those emerging market entry points. In addition to supporting Kansas companies, we also work with bringing buyers in from foreign countries and taking producers to foreign countries on trade missions. So all key functions that we do in the Kansas Department of Agriculture that support the industry help our farmers, ranchers, and agribusinesses day to day. High-path avian influenza, HPAI, bird flu, avian influenza. There's a number of names that you hear in industry today that have impacted our animal agriculture. In 2022, Kansas and other states started seeing high-path avian influenza emerge and impact our poultry industry. To date, high-path has touched all 50 states in the last 3 years. We have so in 2024, there were a number of cases in the winter. We saw that primarily when the wild waterfowl migrated across the state, and we did not experience many impacts throughout the summer as those migratory birds had left. High-path is a disease that lives in the air and has been spread by the wildlife. We anticipated that this winter, in late fall of 2024, we would start to see more cases, and that unfortunately came true, just given the high preference of this virus that's in the environment. We had 10 cases in Kansas through the end of the year. We've not, fortunately, had any cases within the last 30 days, but we have seen impacts to our poultry industry. This most recently, our impacts have been on our small backyard flocks. So I myself have 10 chickens and 2 ducks. We've fortunately not been impacted, but others like me who have a few chickens in their backyard who might have interaction with wildlife have seen some impacts from that virus. We, as a whole, we're in the 3rd year of our outbreak. We've had a total of 42 cases that have impacted our poultry and game bird industry, as well as our backyard flock producers. Our animal health team has response plans that have been implemented and have worked well in helping eradicate the virus from the facilities that have been impacted, but we continue to see an impact. And you continue to see an impact as our egg prices have gone up, and even the poultry, if you're buying chicken breasts, those prices have gone up to the consumer. When you look at the small map of the United States and the impact, you can see the widespread impact. Kansas's poultry industry is much smaller than many other of our peers. We've had under 2 million birds that have been depopulated in Kansas, but some producers in other states have more than 2 or 3 million birds in one facility that have to be euthanized due to the impact of the virus. So this is having a devastating effect on our producers. Last week, the USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins made an announcement that the USDA is rolling out a $1 billion strategy to help combat high-path avian influenza and to help offset the poultry prices that the consumers are experiencing at the grocery store. KDA will continue to work to implement those strategies. Many of them are addressing some of the biosecurity measures that producers can take to help prevent that virus becoming an impact to their facility. Additionally, high-path avian influenza has had an impact beyond the poultry industry. We have also experienced, as well as several other states, the virus taking an impact on our dairy cattle. This virus showed up in the spring of 2024, and we had a handful of producers that noticed a drop in their milk production. Kansas implemented a disease response that was to try to prevent the spread of that virus moving from dairy facilities. One thing to note about the dairy industry, our dairy producers have many animals on site, many head of animals. However, they're constantly having calves, right? We need to have calves so that those females can maintain production, but those calves are moved off-site to other locations, sometimes out of state, to be raised until they're ready to start milking and be bred back into the milk production system. Kansas has a number of calves that come in from around the state, and we have producers here who have dairy operations not only in Kansas but other states. So the movement of lactating cattle has been an issue and a concern when we look at high-path avian influenza. So preventing the movement of lactating animals that were contagious was a critical step. And the USDA at the federal level also implemented movement restrictions, ensuring negative testing for avian influenza when it came to moving those animals. All pieces that we work together with the feds and the states to try and protect our industry here at home. In January, Kansas, along with other states, started participating in the a national milk testing strategy program. This is where our dairy and feed producers take samples at the milk processors, as well as other states are participating in this, and we test to see if there's any avian influenza that's showing up in the raw milk. Pasteurization treats and kills the virus in the process, so creates a consumer safety item for our consumers. But to date, we have not had any new cases that have been found due to that milking testing strategy. But we will continue to monitor Kansas milk to ensure that it is safe and that there's not an outbreak in our dairy industry. Shifting gears to water. Water has been a hot topic. We've had a lot of discussions here during the session on water. I'm not going to go into great depth, but Kansas Department of Agriculture has participated in the local consult meetings and the rounds of public stakeholder hearings that have been held to help garnish input on what are Kansans' concerns in regards to water. We have some key functions as part of our agency that routinely support water and our natural resources and conservation for our farmers and ranchers between our Division of Conservation as well as our Division of Water Resources. I would take just a moment to highlight some of the successes that we've seen in trying to help protect our resource. The first being there on the top of the list is a $500,000 stock water initiative that assisted 15 different livestock facility producers to help conserve water and to recycle water on their feedlot operations. That funding was a direct result of House Bill 2302 that was passed last year. The other item that I would highlight is the $4.5 million that went out at the end of fiscal year 24 and start of 25. This was financial assistance as provided through House Bill 2302 and some excess funds in our conservation program that were able to help assist our high hazard dam owners who are struggling with maintenance on some critically concerning dams. Dams in Kansas are regulated by our Water Structures Program and the Division of Water Resources. And dams in Kansas the threat is based on what is downstream. So not the size of the dam, not how much water is in it or what is the water is being used for, but what's below stream. Are there inhabitable houses? Are there towns? Are there utility infrastructure? Are there roads that might be flooded or impaired if a structure were to fail? So we monitor them by low hazard, significant hazard, and high hazard, and it is a infrastructure concern. So we have tried to provide funding where we can to support those dam owners and in creating repairs and assisting them to rehabilitate. You're going to get me caught up. To rehabilitate their structures to ensure safety for Kansans across the state. Also, we have recently started, and hopefully this is a project that we'll be able to continue, but in our Division of Water Conservation, we have launched the High Plains Aquifer Regional Conservation Partnership. This will leverage $25 million of federal funds to provide support to our producers to adopt better irrigation technology and conservation practices to ultimately conserve water down the road. However, this is one of the, as we move into my next section, this is one of the items that is potentially under review and reconsideration under this Trump administration. In Kansas, the Kansas Department of Agriculture has a number of ties to federal agencies that are our peers or our partners in many different ways. This ranges anything from cooperative agreements to where we perform work for the feds, or we even partner to do contract inspections on our federal partners' behalfs, as well as just simply administer federal funding to Kansans. There are a number of things that the agency routinely monitors at the federal level. What's federal spending amounts? What agencies are getting funding? Where's the Farm Bill progress moving? Because all of those have fiscal impacts that impact the agency. So as you can imagine, this past month, we have been closely monitoring and tracking changes and impacts that this administration has announced that they are taking. Below, you see a number of programs that we have been told that there will be cuts in one way or another, whether it be to their FTEs, funding that supports the program. The list really varies. I want to call out a couple that I think are important that we will have some sort of impact to in Kansas. So the first being the feral swine management program by the USDA Wildlife Services. This is a program that is jointly funded by the federal USDA as well as Kansans. We contribute about $200,000 each year to help support feral swine removal. We do not have large established feral swine herds in Kansas, and that has been because of the partnership and the federal work that we have done. Not to belittle our neighbors, but our states to the east and to the south of us have established large numbers in the millions of feral swine that they are trying to manage. We have worked very hard to create a buffer so that those pigs do not move further north and west. By terminating the contracts of the federal employees, we will not have as many resources to monitor and remove those pigs. Our numbers of removal have been low. We've worked in the few years ago, we were in the thousands. Now we're down to low hundreds of removal because of the efforts that we have made. Feral swine do a lot of damage to producers. They will root up acres of a cornfield overnight as they go to eat those young corn plants. That will cost farmers millions of dollars if they were impacted by that. That is one item that I think we could see soon short-term effects of if it comes to fruition that those contracts, which have been terminated, will come, are carried out later this year. The other one that I would draw attention to is there's been about a $30 million cut to the Food and Drug Administration. And I'm right there with you thinking we need some cuts at the federal level. We try to be conservative at the state. We want our federal partners to be conservative with our taxpayer dollars. But they do have impacts. The FDA is a strong partner when it comes to Kansas and food safety. We implement a number of programs in regard and do contract inspections for the FDA in terms of our food in Kansas. One particular program in particular, it's a small program, but I just want to call out what it does. And that program is the Enhancing Produce Safety Program. So over the years, you may have seen in the news, often produce is one of the media's grabs of what when we have salmonella outbreaks that's found in lettuce or tomatoes or some of those produce items. So there is a program that we implement to our farmers, to our specialty crop growers, to provide them education on what is the correct insecticides and pesticides to use, what are the food handling, how do you handle that product properly to reduce the risk of a foodborne illness being caused by the consumption of those products. That's a program that has been cut, and we have a little bit more material that we'll continue to apply and provide, but we won't be able to have that funding in the future. Lastly, the section there, I just wanted to touch on, there's additional programs that we are monitoring that are under review, and these are largely grants that we implement or administer in some form here in the state, and we are waiting to know what the news are is for future funding and support that they might be providing. So, in conclusion, I do appreciate my job as serving as the Deputy Secretary. It is an honor. It truly is an honor to stand and serve the industry and represent the industry. I come from a long line of family farmers. My husband and I still farm and ranch on the side, and we are raising our children in the agriculture industry. Farmers today are struggling. Their net farm income is going to be as low as we've seen in recent history, and they are the backbone of the state's economy. There will be impacts, hopefully short-lived, by what's going on in today's world. But our farmers are resilient, we will be resilient, and we will stand ready to continue supporting the industry as we can. So with that, I will be glad to stand for any questions.
All right, thank you, Kelsey. And as you know, myself, I'm a producer, farm producer, and long line of agriculture family. And so obviously agriculture has a very big impact, not only to our state, but to myself personally. So going back, you briefly mentioned that there is not a farm bill, which expired in September of 2024. There was a continuation of the previous farm bill, but what is the status of a potential farm bill being passed by Congress anytime soon?
That's an excellent question, Mr. Chairman. That's it's a big open-ended question, and there's a lot of uncertainty out there. I was in D.C. last week, and the House Ag Chairman, G.T. Thompson, spoke to our group. He expressed the interest to get a farm bill by mid-June. However, when we look at the federal funding that is pending, that is going to need an extension before the end of the month, there's a lot of bleak opportunities to actually pass a farm bill. The latest I heard is that they are looking at doing an extension, which they've done the last 18 months for the farm bill. And that is probably the most likely scenario in the short term for us to rely on the Farm Bill sources. It becomes tricky because the Farm Bill does provide allocations, appropriations out to various programs. And if they provide an extension, sometimes that means the program can continue, and sometimes it means it can continue with an enhancement that would allow it to continue operating at its full level. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I don't have a magic 8 ball to tell you what will happen for sure.
All right, I just wanted to touch on that because it has been a concern, and not only myself, but also other producers have asked me about the Farm Bill as well, and not having one being passed by September of last year. Many producers are concerned about that. You had mentioned, what is the total cattle population of the state of Kansas? I know it's more than the people that we have in the state.
So latest estimates were about 6.5 million cattle in the state. The beef market is very strong right now. We've not had a latest census on that. Our numbers are probably much lower. 2 weeks ago at a local sale barn, cow-calf pairs sold for $5,000, which is unheard of. So there is an incentive for our producers to sell as many of their calf herd that they can, because that is the strongest point of our ag industry right now is the feeder cattle. Yeah. But we are low in numbers, but 6.5 is what it was in the last census.
All right, thank you. And then my final question before I open up to others. This has been brought up within the last year. I mean, obviously my family has no intent of selling any land at all. But there has been some that have passed on to heirs, and they have sold either ranch land or crop ground to out-of-state individuals who are now taking that land out of production. For example, there's a section and a half of land that is just directly south of my uncle's farm, and flatland ground, dry land crop, great producing land. And now that entire section and a half is taken out because the person who purchased it wants to have that primarily for hunting. There was a rancher that approached me. He came to our farm shop and talked to me about ranch land that he and his family have rented for years that has recently sold, and the new owner has told him, you have to get your cattle off because we want this for hunting. How prevalent is that where we're taking agricultural land out of production and using it for primarily hunting?
I don't have good statistics on it, but I can confirm it is a growing trend that we are seeing across the state. Sometimes
how does that impact the revenue to the state as far as the agriculture industry?
Yeah, there certainly would be local impacts when we look at those contribution reports of what agriculture is bringing. So anytime we're taking production agriculture out of production, that is diminishing what those contributions and that total ag production there is. But I don't have good numbers. I can track some information down for you. I know K-State K-State Ag Manager has done a little bit of work on that, but I don't have good numbers to share with you offhand.
You know, my father and I have talked about this numerous times, especially in regards to ranch land. I mean, obviously, if an out-of-state individual buys the land, that's their prerogative if they want to do that. But at the same time, you're not going to have a cattle herd on that pasture the entire year. Mm-hmm. And you move them around, obviously, for eating purposes and grassland. So I just wish that those buying the land understood that you can utilize the land for a portion of the year and then still use it for hunting. But they're just completely taking that land out of production whatsoever. And then also, does that still fall under the ag value-based property tax?
A great question. That has been an item that's been debated, certainly, and I don't have a good answer for you of how revenue and the local taxation groups are looking at that.
That's something actually Chairman of Tax and I have also talked about. All right, I'll open up to questions. Representative Sutton.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, there were a couple of things that kind of raised my eyebrow here, but Let's get started on the feral pigs. There was Kansas banned feral hog hunting in 2006, and that still stands. What's the justification for banning sports hunting of feral hogs, but then continuing to fund or beg a federal agency for money to reduce the population of feral hogs, which sports hunting could do profitably?
Kelsey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a great question. So science has shown that by hunting feral swine, that actually creates, encourages the pigs to spread and move. No offense to our sportsmen in the room. Not everyone is a great shot. And if they don't get
That's the justification. Not everyone's a great shot.
No, so the science shows is that when you hunt an animal, and pigs specifically, is that they will spread further out. And so when they are not controlled in an area, the more hunting you do, the further you push them, causing greater destruction to the land in a greater area. One swine sow can have multiple litters in a year, anywhere from 10 to 15 pigs in a litter. So when you're pushing them further out and they're continuing to have populations, their reproduction, the population numbers grow immensely. So hunting has not been an effective tool to reduce the spread or reduce the numbers of animals. There is a number of hunting, some states have actually continued to repeal their hunting because they have shown the spread of the pigs instead of the reduction.
Representative Sutton?
I think we're going to agree to disagree on that. I've got a hell of a lot of evidence right here showing me that it controls the population just fine. And the notion of killing animals, increasing their population, doesn't really work for me. But let's move on to the bird flu here. I want to make sure I took accurate notes here. 2 million birds destroyed, 42 cases confirmed over the course of 3 years. I'm having trouble seeing that we're mitigating effectively. First off, it's lasted for 3 years. We've destroyed a heck of a lot more than we've ever found in cases. What's the strategy here? I'm not following this.
Kelsey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So high-path avian influenza is a flu that has been around a number of years. In the United States, we had an outbreak in 2015, and during that time, the genomic sequencing on the dead birds was found that it was being spread to facility. There might be migratory birds, wild birds that come through, drop the virus, but then it was being spread from multiple barns. In Kansas, we don't have very many producers who have large multiple barns side by side, but we have a couple. And at that time, across the nation and in Kansas, we worked to implement what we called food safety, or the poultry security, biosecurity plans, which were enhancing the biosecurity measures, meaning we're not walking one producer or one employee from one barn to the next without changing protective gear, without changing booties so that you're not spreading viruses. You're limiting the equipment that moves between facility. And those strategies have worked this year. There is still an abundance of virus in the environment that we cannot control. However, if we can reduce our poultry industry from being exposed to those environmental virus sheds, then we are reducing the numbers of birds that are being impacted. In this outbreak, in 2020, since 2022, there's been, in Kansas, we cannot prove that any of the spread has been from facility to facility. It's been unique genomes that have come from the wild birds that have been impacting our producers. So enhancing that biosecurity has been immense. You think about an open air barn or chickens that are running open, they're going to be exposed to that. Some of our backyard producers, they might have a pond on their facility. The wild geese are coming, landing, drinking there, defecating there. They are spreading that virus, and then the domestic population is drinking that same area. We've worked to provide education to help reduce those interactions between wildlife and the production groups, and that's made an impact. Secretary Rollins last week said there was only one case that USDA has found of a facility spread. It's all been because of the high virus shed in the environment that is still finding its way into our facilities, unfortunately. So part of the strategy will be upping those biosecurity measures. What kinds of different equipment do our producers need to continue to eliminate those risks? As well as, for consumers specifically, they're looking at lowering increasing the ability for eggs to be imported into the state, into the country, to help offset those costs directly to the consumer. So there's a lot of strategies. It's very scientific, but the genomic sequencing all points to better biosecurity.
I can continue just a little bit?
Yes, please.
Okay. I would probably like to, in addition to security, like to look at efficiency, since apparently we're killing 47,000 birds for every case we find. That's pretty extreme in my mind, and I don't think it would fly in any other area of the country or any other area of our treatment of disease.
Yeah. The virus is quite prolific, and its mortality rate when an animal is impacted with it in the poultry industry is topping 90%. So the most humane thing to do is when a bird becomes infected is to euthanize it, because it will suffer from the virus and very few recover if they're not euthanized.
There were 42 cases. Okay, maybe those were compassion kills, but what about the other 2 million?
Kelsey?
Again, if there's facilities that have the virus starts showing up, it starts killing off their birds, and the protocols right now that are in place is to go in to euthanize the entire barn or whatever in that facility.
Because it spreads very quickly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's 42 of them.
Do you have another question?
I do, actually. I wanted to know what sort of impact have we seen so far from the 2 days of tariffs?
So the markets have all took a steep dive Monday afternoon when they announced. They took a nosedive yesterday and today, or yesterday and Tuesday, they were low. Again, that short term, they've took some immediate reactions. As I mentioned, tariffs can have a positive impact. We did get some positive trade agreements in place, but there's short-term impacts that we're going to note for sure.
So the short-term downturn in the market is what you're most alarmed about?
I mean, it's what's noteworthy at
I would
this
say
point.
in the agriculture industry, it's been a downturn for quite some time. You have low commodity prices that have been consistent, not just in the short term. This has been going on for years. And you also have the pricing for machinery, land, seed, fertilizer has all shot up. So the output costs are greatly exceeding the commodity prices of where they're currently at and where they've been for quite some time.
Well, Mr. Chair, if I could correct you, those tariffs have only been in effect for 2 days.
No, I'm just saying that the low commodity prices have been in place for quite a while.
Oh,
and
you mean there's more to it than that?
Well, yeah, it's a world market. I mean, it all affects how everything is played out.
I'm messing with you.
With the costs, I mean, especially with costs that have shot up in the last few years, and I would say in fertilizer has almost doubled when you're trying to put out a crop.
Very good. That answers my question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Representative Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to respond to Representative Sutton. What the fear is, and we've been very successful with our hogs, keeping our hogs in check versus other states, is that if they were huntable, that sportsmen would bring hogs into the state to hunt, and then they would escape and expand the population. So that's where that comes from. And it's been very successful.
Representative Mosier.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Kelsey, for your presentation and for talking about my livelihood. It makes my heart smile. So for the swine people, 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days is the gestation period for a sow. They can have 2 litters a year, and if they have a dozen, you're looking at an astronomical increase in feral swine in Kansas if they're not controlled. And the $5,000 pairs, I'm guessing those were commercial cattle and not papered cattle. Okay, so there's a big
That's correct.
difference there, and I've never heard of commercial pairs bringing $5,000 in my lifetime. Also, just wanted to say that Grandpa's Best is in District 106, and I have had the privilege of visiting that facility. It's a great little place. They make they compact hay and make little round hay things for rabbits to eat. They sell little miniature bales. They use all their extra hay that, they don't sell, all the bits and pieces, and do a fantastic job marketing it. So anyway, thank you very much for being here.
Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here today. In terms of surveillance for avian influenza in livestock in Kansas, who's responsible? Is it KDA that's the lead agency in the state?
Kelsey.
Yes, that is correct. It falls under the Animal Health Commissioner's purview, and he's part of the Animal Division at KDA.
Representative Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a follow-up question and kind of a comment. As you know, I'm involved in pest control, and so I follow kind of what happens in that industry, and it does help support the agricultural industry. I think back in January, USDA confirmed 4 black rats tested positive for avian influenza, and they're a vector for many diseases. So if someone's out in the field and gets a specimen, I know we have a Kansas vet diagnostic laboratory here in Manhattan, but you also have a laboratory through KDA. So if someone has a specimen, how does someone go through getting something tested if they were concerned about something like that?
See.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great question. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to that. So Kansas Department of Agriculture does have a laboratory. We do food testing there, pesticide samples, and some meat samples, and along with milk. However, we do not provide any regulatory sampling when it comes to potential disease threats or concerns that our animal producers or the general population come across when it comes to sick animals. All of that work is done by our veterinary diagnostic lab that is housed at K-State's veterinary medicine, but they work in conjunction with us, and we get regular weekly reports from them about what diseases they are finding, if it's a reportable disease, and what trends that they're seeing, because that purview falls under the Animal Health Commissioner.
Any further questions for Kelsey? All right, seeing none, thank you for being here, and thank you for giving us an update on the agriculture industry in the state of Kansas. Committee, we're going to deviate just a little bit. We'll get to former Secretary Lorenz next in regards to the Kansas Water Plan Implementation Framework. But we do need to work on Senate Bill 14, and we have some members that are going to be leaving, so I just want to make sure that we have ample time to do that. So I'm going to open up final action on Senate Bill 14. Is there a motion to open up discussion on Senate Bill 14? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the purpose of discussion, I make a motion that we pass out Senate Bill 14 favorably for passage.
All right, is there a second? Second by Representative Hoffman. Any discussion on Senate Bill 14? Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned yesterday, I was going to have an amendment, and so they're going to pass that out.
Sorry. While that's being passed out, Representative Hoffman, could you please describe your amendment to Senate Bill 14?
All right. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this amendment, the balloon is just on the first, at the very beginning. It just says, during any regular session of the legislature, if the legislature passes an appropriation bill providing for appropriations for the fiscal year for state agencies, the governor vetoes the appropriations bill in its entirety, the legislator fails to override such veto, then these provisions shall take effect in the ensuing fiscal year. So what this does is make sure that we as a appropriators do pass a budget, it goes to the governor. If the governor vetoes it, we're not able to override it and you know, ensuring budgets and all that. And then of course, as it continues, if we're not able to do that by June 30th, then this provision would go into effect.
All right, committee, you've heard the amendment. Is there a second on the amendment? Seconded by Representative Francis. Discussion on the amendment.
Yes.
Representative Ballard.
Oh, thank you. So I'm just my apologies, but I'm not clear what that does because maybe I'm reading it wrong. It says if we fail to override it, then the provisions in this section shall take effect for the ensuing year. So was it the previous budget, or if we fail, you'll go on and do what it is you want to do?
Representative Hoffman.
Yeah, under this scenario, I got that, yeah. Under this scenario, if we create a budget, we send it to the governor vetoes it, there no longer is a budget, and then we would try to override that veto. If we were not able to override that veto, there would not be a budget. And so then if we continue to do that and could not get a budget by the July 1st, then the parameters of this would go into effect. So it would, you know, I mean, there's quite a few steps in there that would have to be done, but it's basically if you want to go further, if we create a budget, the governor vetoes it in its entirety, and we override that veto, that budget is law now.
Okay, so then if you don't override it, are you going to the previous year budget, or are you going to still do the one that the bill you wanted?
No, it would be the previous year's budget as lined out in the rest of this bill.
Okay, thank you.
Any further discussion on the amendment? Representative Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And while I agree with this, I wonder if the 30th is time enough to, you know, when we were here 114 days, it starts getting pretty dicey about the 15th of June to make sure that we have money and people are going to be paid. So I'm just questioning if we wanted to move that date to the 15th so that there would be some time.
I believe it's the 30th because that's the end of the fiscal year.
Right, correct.
So I think we would leave it on June 30th.
Okay. I just remember what happened before.
I hope we don't have the 115-day sessions like we've had in the past. I've been privy to 2 of those. Any further discussion on the amendment? Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question on, and the legislature fails to override such veto. Does this mean that that we take an actual vote on it, or just if the veto is sustained? Does this require legislative action to actually vote and sustain the veto, or I'm confused by that?
I would assume it's both.
Yeah, I think that would be right. It would be either way. If we either took a vote or did not take a vote, I think it would go into effect.
Is that clear in this language? I just want to make sure.
That might be a question for Jill.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, if you fail to override by action or no action, you have failed to override the veto. So no action is failing to override the veto.
Thank you for the clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further discussion? All right, seeing none, Representative Hoffman, you may close on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I close.
All right, committee, you've heard the amendment by Representative Hoffman. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Amendment passes. We're back on the bill on Senate Bill 14. Representative Estes.
If I may ask Jill a question, I don't see a definition of continuing appropriation, and for the purposes of the bill, I'd like a definition, please.
Jill.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Estes, it would be the appropriations that were made in the previous fiscal year.
Would the chair be open to a conceptual amendment that adds that definition? And I ask for that because I've encountered a situation this year where there's kind of a belief that appropriations are ongoing and we don't have something that are ongoing. And the word continuing is so similar to ongoing that I think the definition that Jill offered would be very helpful for.
So you just want to change the terminology from ongoing to continuing?
No, I would like to add the definition to the bill.
Right. I think that would be, I'll be open to that. So
Thank
is that a
you.
motion?
That's a motion.
Second, is there a second? Second by Representative Mosher. Discussion on the motion. All right, seeing none. Representative Estes, you may close.
I close.
All right, committee, you've heard the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, motion passes. We're back on Senate Bill 14 as amended. Any further discussion on Senate Bill 14? Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I plan on supporting the bill. I don't think it's a necessarily terrible idea. I can see in a doomsday scenario where it might come in handy. But I will go ahead and give you my Nostradamus prediction. Never in the history of Kansas have we ever left without having passed a budget successfully. We pass this, we will. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that on site. Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand what the bill is trying to do. I guess I don't see where it's really necessary. And I just think there's more to this bill than is actually written here. So for that reason, maybe that's my own personal feeling on it, but there was part of a testimony that referred to should governors veto a whole bill. So, I mean, I'm not saying it's after the Democratic governor. It could be any kind of governor, but I'm not sure it's really necessary. And for that reason, I'm going to vote no.
Any further discussion on Senate Bill 14? Representative Helgerson.
You know, what we're going to have is a situation we don't really know how it's going to end up. Let me ask Jill, how many years does this go on? If we do it for if we do it for 1 year, could it go for a second year?
Jill.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Helgerson, yes.
So the legislature, that's major constitutional obligation, only obligation, which is supposed to put a budget together, could be put in a situation where we're going to come to loggerheads with a governor, we don't pass a budget, and then that may stay the current budget for the entire term of the governor. You know, I joked yesterday about the idea that maybe the legislature shouldn't get paid because that's our constitutional obligation. And if we're not going to pass a budget and come to an agreement with the governor, maybe we shouldn't get our salary increase. Well, I was joking about it, but maybe I should also add the governor. We do not want to follow the model in D.C. We also know that this is a reaction to stubbornness, and I'm going to use stubbornness among the second floor and can't get me in any more trouble, and the Republican leadership. Well, and I agree. I understand. In some ways, though, for all of you that know me well enough and have seen me introduce a 2% reduction or controlling the governor's budget by telling them that the second floor can only put an increase of X percent because I don't want to see the continual growth of this government, it is taking the hands away from us in other ways that we don't even understand yet. And there are pitfalls in this that you have not looked at yet that I'm starting to investigate because I love the opportunity of having a controlled budget and having a governor make, allocations and heading in certain directions. I know the train's running, but, you know, take a deep look at what you're jumping into before you leap.
Representative Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just disagree with the previous speaker. This does not mean that we do not do our job. And the governor currently has line item veto for a budget. This only goes into effect when we pass a budget and the governor vetoes the entire budget. It does not apply to line item vetoes. So I think some of this is hysterics, honestly. I mean, I think that if this ever comes into play, it's not going to be because the legislature overreached. It will be because the executive branch overreached. Thank you.
Any further discussion on Senate Bill 14? All right, Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I added an additional concern for all of the legislation that a legislature may have passed with a fiscal note, especially if we do have years where we're not doing omnibus or trailer bills. All of those bills and their fiscal notes would not have funding if we did just go back to the previous year's budget. So while we would be able to come back after session and appropriate those, if we pass a new budget, it does add an extra layer. And to me, yeah, it does feel like both branches of government are not doing their job. I'm very skeptical of this as a member of the Appropriations Committee. I think, you know, bringing this to the floor is absolutely fine. But from that to come from us, the ones that are the appropriators, the ones that have sat through all the hearings, heard all of the needs for this funding, I just don't think that's the right message to send to Kansans. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further discussion? All right, Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we pass out Senate Bill 14 as amended favorably for passage.
All right, committee, you've heard the motion. Is there a second? Second by Representative Hoffman. All those in favor of passing out Senate Bill 14 as amended, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion passes. All right. All right. Thank you for letting me deviate from the agenda just a little bit so we can get that, since I mentioned before some members are going to be leaving early. So now we're going to turn it over to Julie Lorenz, who is back in committee in a different capacity as the former Secretary of Transportation. She's going to be giving us an update on the Kansas Water Plan Implementation Framework. Ms. Lorenz.
Thank you. It's good to be with many of you who I have had the chance to be in front of before, either with transportation or water this year. So thank you for the opportunity. And Chair, before we get started, you know, I can do this in 5 minutes, 50 minutes. What would work well for your committee, and leave time for questions?
We actually have about 30 minutes, so.
3 days. I'm going to stick with the chairman and not Representative Sutton on this issue.
3 days? And we're not scheduled to meet tomorrow, so.
All right. I will
take it as long as you want.
All right. Thank you. Lots of good information to share with you. And I will start with, there are similarities between transportation and water, but they are certainly not the same thing. They're both important for human life and for our economy, and there are things that we can learn from the transportation program, as you'll see reflected as I start to talk about our process to build a 10-year water program. We'll start first with this map, and I want to say, and you don't often hear someone say this quite as bluntly as this, but this map is unfair. And that is something to kind of wrap your mind around as we think about policy and investments from a state perspective. It's unfair because in the West, we don't have enough water, and in the East, in some cases, we have too much water. Also, this is a situation where there's a two-way street, so to speak. The actions that humans take by irrigating or by building dams impacts our water supply and our water quality. On the other hand, Mother Nature comes into play, and sometimes we get rain, sometimes we don't get enough rain. The aquifer recharges at different rates. So it's a different space when we think about water because of both human behavior as well as Mother Nature. And those are both things to take into account. On the west, when I say we don't have enough water, we can see our aquifers are running out of water. It's important to recognize that the counties that sit above aquifers generate $57 billion in GDP per year. So it's quite important. And on the east side of our state, our reservoirs are filling up with silt, and 2/3 of our population rely on reservoirs to both provide flood protection as well as drought protection. So it's really a quite important issue. In addition to human health, it also is important from an economic perspective. Our two biggest industries, ag and manufacturing, rely on water. And in terms of economic growth, so important because companies will evaluate, for the most part, if a community has 40 years of water supply before they decide whether to move into that community. So it's important from both a health perspective as well as for our economy. A question we get from folks sometimes is, so if you can't buy enough water for the West, or you can't clean out these reservoirs without spending tons of money, so what's the purpose? Why should we invest tons of money in water? And I would suggest to you there are a couple of things to think about. One, money is needed, but two, we need to change the way we think about how we deliver water services in our state. I'm going to talk a lot about that. And three, I would suggest to you the hardest part of all is in some cases we need behavior change. And those are things that you can incentivize in some cases, and in other cases you can't. So why do we need to tackle water? It's important to our health, it's important to our environment, to our economy. And there are investments that we can make that can really change the needle, move the needle. But we have to be really thoughtful about how we do that. So in terms of investments, how can we make sure our investments are delivering what they need to do? We can protect public health and safety by replacing some of our aging infrastructure. We can take preventive actions against harmful algae blooms that contaminate our water supplies. We can provide greater economic stability by incentivizing water conservation and by increasing water storage. The plan that we are going to talk about, the implementation of the water plan, sets forth a specific framework for developing regional project pipelines. So this isn't like a pipeline, it's rather a list of projects in prioritized order with cost estimates so you can understand what needs to be built. I see Representative Francis shaking his head. He understands, nodding his head. He understands this is a concept that comes from the IKE program where you identify needs, you build out feasibility studies for projects, and as you have funding available, you move forward with those. We know that we need folks to understand how projects will be prioritized, so much like we've done through local consult. KDOT has criteria that's been established so that folks can track how projects will be selected, and that same sort of process has been being moved forward with this water program. And I'd also like to point out, this is an important place to also talk about the importance of communities and interactions with communities. Hayes, for example, is a great example of both their focus on conservation and that they've been at it for a long time. So for those who say, and it was in, I can't remember which committee, that was sort of like, well, we've been talking about water for so long. Why is this so hard? It's both a local responsibility, it's a state responsibility, and it takes that cooperation and investment on both sides to really start to move the needle. And having this long-term view is just as important as the immediate actions. You have to have both to start to move that needle. So if there's a slide in this whole deck that this is my favorite one, and it came from participants at local consult because it's a pretty bold and it's a pretty pointed question or point, and it's really true. A community without a plan is a bad investment. So I can't stand in front of you all and say water is a great investment if there isn't a good plan, if you haven't looked at needs, if you haven't assessed the priority. And this is coming from Kansans who say, quit putting money into something if there isn't a strong plan that people understand and have contributed to. So that's why I'm excited to be here today to explain to you what the plan looks like and how it builds upon the input from Kansans all across the state. So in terms of where we are right now, I think you all have the framework in front of you. We have a water plan, the 2022 Kansas Water Plan. It's built in many respects on Governor Brownback's task force that was here years ago. And those ideas have continued to evolve. But what's needed now is to move from this plan into an implementation framework. So that's the work that's been going on for about the last year. So we now have a roadmap for the next 10 years, a dynamic water program for Kansas, and recommendations, specific recommendations on how to improve delivery. So that's where we are. The next steps really come to the legislature. We need a task force, much like the Ike task force. At the time, it was the 2018 legislative task force that went around the state and heard from communities about what their needs are and what they would like to see in the next program. Some additional flexibility and some additional guardrails at the same time, new kinds of programs. Kansans need sort of this 10-year rolling program, I'll discuss that more in a minute, with dedicated or identified funding sources. That's up to the legislature. I can talk to you about different scenarios, outcomes that have been identified, but it will be up to the legislature to identify those specific funding sources. And quite frankly, there are some difficult policy kinds of conversations that also have to take place around things like incentives, because that's something that the legislature will want to weigh in as well. So there's good work to be done, and I'll talk about getting into the Wayback Time machine in just a minute. I certainly don't have Kelsey's awful edibles or whatever she talked about, but I do have a Wayback Time machine that I'll be able to talk about. All right. In terms of, we have 8 specific recommendations. We could have had 100, but we really focused on the top 8. One is to deliver this multi-generational promise, this 50-year promise that all Kansans should have access to a 50-year water supply that doesn't currently exist in all parts of our state. We need to move forward toward that as our goal. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. We need regional planning in these regional project pipelines so that folks know what projects could be coming to their area if dollars are available, and it also allows then local communities to start planning in that direction as well, and it's an economic enhancement tool. We need to talk about how we administer grants. And if you are a community that hasn't looked at the opportunity, and by the way, not all communities are situated in a way that, like physically, they can be part of a regional water system. Like that doesn't, it's just physically not possible in all parts of the state. But on behalf of taxpayers, they ought to have to take a look at that before grant dollars are made available. So there are some of those sorts of, whether you call them incentives or requirements, that as legislators, we need to have some discussions about how you put those guardrails in place on a 10-year program and how you incentivize those kinds of participation so that you make sure you're getting good investments. We need to streamline our water programs. Right now we have 14 agencies that touch water in different sorts of ways. We need to take a look at that. We have more than 50 individual programs that are related to water. We can streamline there as well. I'm not saying that you don't have visibility into those specific investments, but we can do a better job in terms of streamlining and making sure that Kansans know who to call when they have a water problem, which gets us to the dashboard so that folks have better information that's more transparent and easy to find. And to emphasize, this goes back to those 50 line items, that we're emphasizing problem solving and not continuing to invest in each line item, but really thinking about, do these dollars, how are they impacting problems? And we can talk a bit more about prioritizing cost share and making sure that we are working closely and better with our federal partners. Okay, Texas, I would point to Texas quickly. We'll walk through this. This is a state that's doing a really good job in terms of regional planning. I would also point out they're on a different size and scale than we are, but the concepts are good. They have developed projections for their water needs. So when you look here, you can see that they have projected over time less water will be needed for agriculture, for irrigation, more water will be needed for municipalities, about the same amount for manufacturing. We need to do this at the statewide level as well as at the regional level so that we make sure that as we think about economic development and communities' health, they know where their water is today and what kinds of water they'll need in the future so that we can make sure that the investments that are made are tracking with where those projections are. It's a lot like on the highway side of things. You look at what's needed today, fatality rates, pavement quality, those sorts of things, and what anticipated miles are as you begin to figure out where you're going to invest your limited dollars in transportation. Texas also looks at what they need to invest in 50 years in terms of new water supplies, drinking water, and their wastewater systems. So we need not just to be doing good planning for today, but we need that view to the 50 years so that we can do a better job of prioritizing those investments. Here's what the Texas Senate Committee on Water found, is that every 100,000 acre feet of incremental water supply can underwrite about $30 billion worth of economic activity. And I would point to this, and again, we're extrapolating from Texas, so I'm not saying that we have not done our due diligence on these numbers, but they are a good benchmark to think about. If we took the formula that they use, which is each gallon of local water supply in a major Texas metro area generates about $1 in economic activity. In the Wichita area, about $55 million in economic activity would be generated every day from their water supply. That's how valuable it is, because it either generates, or if you don't have the water available, you are removing economic opportunity. Okay, so let's talk a bit about how this framework has been constructed. So first of all, there's a 2-year ramp-up period. I'll talk a bit more about that, but the long story short on that one is that the agencies need time to strengthen. We need to do evaluation of programs. So there's a 2-year ramp-up period before you get to the full-on additional funding for the agencies. And again, there are 8 recommendations that help us get to that point. So I'll talk a bit more about how this works. We built this framework from a really extensive stakeholder engagement process. We talked to more than 1,500 Kansans. We held more than 50 meetings with stakeholders, including like the Kansas Water Authority and the RACs and local consult, groundwater management districts, Kansas Farm Bureau, Kansas Livestock Association, the conservation districts, and on and on and on. We have, and I think this is the one for the appropriators. This is the one you all are going to be most keenly interested in. We have 43 clearly defined outcomes to achieve in the next 2 years. You ought to take a look at those outcomes and hold everyone accountable for delivering those outcomes. You have to earn additional funding, is what I would say. I mean, the agencies is what I mean. That's what I should be a little clear about that. And there are 8,
Took it as that.
and there are 8 recommendations. The key takeaways from talking to all these Kansans is that there's urgency associated with the need for greater investment in water over the long term. We have over 100 Kansas communities that have 25 years or less of water supply available. And when I say that, that means using the well that they currently have, pumping at the current rate, they would run out of water in 25 years or less. You can look at Leota, for example, out west. They have run out of water. They're going to have to go to wells that are about, it's either 6 or 8 miles north, and pump and pipe water into for their community. And we can go on, Sublette is another one. I don't think they have found water yet. So we can go on and on around the state where communities either are looking for water or will need to soon. We have more than 70,000 Kansans who are using water supply that has 1 or more health violations. So there is urgency around both health as well as for our economy. Kansans are supportive of an annual investment of about $140 million per year so that we can have access to 50-year water supply. That is a big deal. I would also say hats off to Kansans who are super practical and have said not quite yet. We want to see a ramp-up period. We want to understand how the outcomes are developed and how they are judged. So we'll talk about that. So why a 10-year program? As I've said, our communities are running out of water in some cases. In other cases, we haven't talked as much about on the east side of the state, but we are filling up with sediment. There's not going to be, that we don't have backup supplies on the east side of the state. We don't necessarily have enough water for some of our economic development opportunities. In order to deliver these large-scale kinds of projects, you need a planning horizon. You need to do some of that feasibility work. We also need to provide some certainty for communities, for companies, that they'll see that there's an ongoing progress on our water issues. We know that we need a dynamic program that can change and be flexible over time, that is in touch with communities and with citizens to make adjustments as needed. And stakeholders need this consistency. They need to understand how decisions are made, much like the local consult process in transportation, that they're going to talk to the agencies every 2 years, and they can have input on shaping how those investments are made. What if we have a year where we have lots and lots of rain, or we have lots and lots of drought? We may have to shift the way some of our investments are being targeted. So that flexibility is needed. Certainly, I want to say the Kansas Water Authority and the RACs certainly have input and into this whole process as well. So when we look at this dynamic 10-year program, I want to walk you through this timeline just a little bit. This 2-year ramp-up period from 2025 to 2027, the work begins around evaluation of programs, some enhancements where they could be most helpful, such that by 2035, we come back and we renew the program in a different sort, and we'll take a look at what's been accomplished and what's needed in the next 10 years. So it's a rolling 10-year program. When I talk about this 50-year water promise, we're at 2025. The target year is 2075, 50 years of water supply. By 2035, you extend that to 2085. It is, I don't know how to deliver forever water. Like, that is just, I don't know how you do that, but you can wrap your mind around 50 years. You can do the analysis, and you can roll that out every 10 years so that you're making good investments and that you can do the data analysis to keep you moving in the right direction. This chart shows, there are 3 colors chosen intentionally. Green is the legislature, blue represents the agencies, and yellow are stakeholders. Currently, there's conversation, right, going on about this ramp-up period, evaluation process. The agencies have already started that work on building out new programs, thinking about evaluations, how they would reform some of their programs, how they could be more flexible, what the metrics will be, what the evaluation metrics will be. But that's where the legislature starts to come in the green, is to have those same kinds of conversations and to think about this task force that would identify what you really want to see out of a 10-year program. We're going to talk about outcomes in just a minute. But the task force is critical. A legislative task force is critical to really put both the money and the guardrails around what you want to see out of a 10-year program. So for those folks who said a couple of weeks ago, why are we still working on this? Why haven't we like cracked the nut on this? I would go back and look at get in the Wayback Time Machine for the CHP. Governor Hayden called a special session. It failed. They didn't get a transportation program. It took a task force to develop this comprehensive highway program. From that led to the CTP, the Comprehensive Transportation Program, which then led to T-Works, which then led to IKE. We have benefited from 40 years of consistent investment, consistent evaluation, every 10 years modernizing the programs a little bit. There's a good news and bad news here. The good news is we've done this local consult process. A legislative task force doesn't need to start from scratch. You've got good information to work from. However, it's also starting a new program, and that is a lift. We've got 3 agencies primarily responsible for water. You got to think about how that organization would look. You got to think about the money piece. There are lots of things to sort of think through, but you're not starting from scratch. And I would just say, how often in your career do you have the opportunity to start something that could serve the state so well as a transportation program? And in this case, it's more complicated. Water is more complicated. But I would also suggest it has far-reaching impacts that would be really fantastic to start working through. All right, the framework, this is now I'm going to get into I think the part that the appropriations people will really like. It's that you can choose, you can scale your investment and the outcomes. So for example, you'll see we're going to talk about the $60 million base budget. We'll talk about what enhancements could buy, whether those happen or not. The thinking is very important, and then what outcomes you'd see over a 10-year period. You might say, well, how did you get to $140 million? We didn't start there. We went out and talked to Kansans about 3 potential investment scenarios. Stand pat, the $60 million, then move the needle at $120 per year, and a game changer at $360 million per year. More importantly, we asked Kansans, more than just the money part, what are the outcomes associated with each of those investment levels do you most want? We took their thinking about what outcomes they found most valuable, and we got to this proposed scenario of $140 million. You can see and it's outlined in the framework, where we very clearly have said, what is the problem area? Is it aquifers? Is it reservoirs? Is it water quality? What would be the investment level? What can be accomplished in 2 years? And what could be accomplished over 10 years? Again, that's where the refinement of the outcomes you're looking for in 10 years would certainly be part of the conversation, because the outcomes scale to the investment. And as I've said in transportation, and I say in water too, that's the important piece. Because you're going to have business cycles. There are going to be years where you have more money. There are going to be years where you have less money. The hard part is deciding if you're going to add money or take money away. You want to have some assurance that you know then what the outcomes are going to be, right? Like, it's not just saying, I feel like you should get less, you should get more. You need to know what you're buying, and that's how we've put this together. So, for example, and this is, I'm going to orient you to the scalability piece. So, for example, in the base budget on water quality, which is septic repairs and replacing private replacement and also testing wells. So you could, in the base budget, get to 10 counties. If there were enhancements, if there was a $500,000 enhancement, you could get to tests in 25 counties. By the end of 10 years, you would get to more than 50 counties, multiple locations in those 50 counties. Part of the conversation is, at $140 million, is that the kind of number you'd want to see, or would you rather see more investment or better outcomes, for example, in reservoirs? This is where you're able to start to compare scenarios, investment scenarios. So in the base, water supply for about 1.1 million Kansans by addressing the dredging pilot in Tuttle Creek. If there were enhancements, you could get to working on the John Redmond Reservoir, and that would help about 1.2 million Kansans. Over 10 years, right, so there's work that needs to be done in terms of feasibility and other things, but over the course of 10 years, at $140 million per year, you would have addressed 100% of in-reservoir sediment at these various lakes for 1.7 million Kansans. Well, you can then contrast that. So now you can think about water quality investments, reservoir investments. You can think about resiliency. In this case, this is long-term thinking around infrastructure and tech assistance. And same sort of thing. How do we want to see these grant dollars flowing? What parameters around the grant dollars? The idea, again, is scalability and being able to do the trade-offs, because that's really what it all comes down to, is where do the investments go and what are the benefits associated with those investments? This is a piece that I think is really important, and this is the independent evaluation. Our programs need to be evaluated to see if they are achieving. In some cases, our programs are doing a great job and maybe they need more money. In some cases, the programs are working, but maybe they need to be tweaked. In other cases, maybe the programs aren't working so well. I would suggest independent evaluation on these, because it's hard when you've been developing and implementing programs and you've got good relationships across the state with all kinds of stakeholders. It's frankly easier if you have an independent evaluation. And it just, I think, brings a level of assurance to the evaluation that would be helpful if you need to make changes. All right, and how this works, we've got a declining water supply. We've now got a 50-year, very bold vision to provide water. Every Kansan would have access to water for the next 50 years. We know communities need to have a plan. They have critical infrastructure. We have, in this framework, lots of good tech assistance to help them, both some requirements as well as tech assistance, so that they can have a plan, so that they can think about regional water systems. It's interesting, in Texas, they're starting to talk, and I'm not suggesting this for Kansas, it was just eye-opening to me. Texas is starting to think about a water grid, much like you would think about an electric grid, which I think is really interesting. And then Kansans struggle to navigate the 50-plus programs, and under this framework, you would start to see those different programs streamlined with a no wrong door policy, so that anyone can call. If you call Department of Ag and you've got a resiliency problem, they can help get you to. They would have the same access to information that is if you called the water office. And I want to end with a big thank you. The support that the House has provided on water has been over the last couple of years has been very impactful, very important. The momentum is there. We had a webinar on Friday afternoon, January 17th. 200 folks were on that. I was surprised at 3:30, and they were still on at 4:30. People are concerned and very interested. We had another webinar last Thursday, February 27th at noon. We had 170 folks that wanted to tune in to have an update. And so really, this is my favorite and my last slide. So Representative Minnick, so at the water conference in the fall, we ended with a session, and he moderated. And I will say this, our future is bright. Our future is bright. So these students, these really smarties from K-State and from KU and from Fort Hays State were all on the stage. And they all do either water research or they're involved in ag or whatever. But Joe on the far right there from Fort Hays State, and he's also in the reserves. So his story, I think, is the most compelling. So he says he's either he wants to go back to his family farm. He's either a fourth or fifth generation guy. He's going to go back. And he said, and I think he puts it really well, he's like, I want to do the right thing. I want to conserve. I want to use technology. I want to do all the right things so that my kids that I don't have yet and my grandkids that I don't have yet, but I hope I have someday, they can choose. If they want to farm, they can do it because we will have water. But I also have to be able to make a living at the same time. And so I can't, he's like, so I want to do both. I want to conserve, I want to leave my farm to my future, but I have to be able to make a living too. And so I think we see that kind of catch-22 sometimes as we think about water. We have to invest and we have to provide a path forward. But I got to tell you, these kids were pretty fantastic. And I was like, good. They are smarties, and we will all benefit for keeping them in our state and for them to be our future leaders. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, and thank you again for giving us the presentation, Ms. Lorenz. And I guess the one question that I have is, in the past couple of years, we have dedicated additional dollars into the water plan and for water, fully funding the water plan as it was, when it was instituted. But looking at the task force, should we just pause on increases and wait for the task force to develop the implementation of how we want to address the water issues? Would that be your suggestion, or?
No. No, that'd not be my suggestion. But I do have a response for you. I would say that money is important, but so is thinking.
And that's why I'm saying
yes.
we don't pause the money that we have. We still have that going.
No, I think that there are outcomes that have been identified with some of those enhancements. That's what I would recommend is you look at what the outcomes are with some of the enhancements to choose the ones that I would most advocate for. It's that the evaluation piece, because that's going to provide data that you're going to want as you roll into a program. I would keep the independent evaluation piece. The other piece is around funding a task force and some of this regional planning. And to be clear, it's not regional planning across the state. It's 2 pilots. And so we need to be thoughtful about where you pick the 2 pilots. But we need to get a handle on this idea around how do we build project pipelines for water? How do we prioritize those? How do we think about, a good example is Caney and Coffeyville. Caney's running out of water. They went to Coffeyville. They're now going to buy 250,000 gallons per day. Coffeyville's happy because now they've got a consistent customer. Caney can afford to pay to some degree to have that water shipped in. But we're going to see that play out over and over again around the state. We need folks to have plans on how they're going to access water, and so that it doesn't, so that you avoid crisis, but that you don't spend inordinate amounts of money on transferring water. We've got to figure out how you can conserve water in places and how we're going to be able to provide that. So I would look at the outcomes, suggested with the enhancements, and go from there.
Right, so going back to the comparison with the Ike Transportation Plan and the task force that was created in 2018, transportation plans have a dedicated funding source. Has there been any discussion in regards to a funding source other than state general fund for the water?
Yes, so, yes. So recognizing not the agency's role or local consult role, but we did ask the question of Kansans. So in the back of the report, you'll find thoughts from Kansans, no surprise. Sales tax was certainly up there. Looking at some fees, many of our water fees haven't been increased for a long time. I will tell you, they don't generate as much as you'd like, but that's a place to look as well. So there are thoughts around funding sources that are in the back of the report, but no specific recommendation.
Well, and I would, go back to one of my home community of Russell. They just recently passed a increase in the sales tax for the purpose of water, and the extenuation of that, what they need to do to address water, because actually Russell and Hayes are partnered together with the R9 Ranch in trying to move those water rights so they can have a sustainable water in those two communities. And I bet you anything Representative Wassinger was glad that you commented on the city of Hayes, because I remember being in high school and Hayes was implementing these conservation efforts where you would go to a restaurant in Hayes and you had to ask for a glass of water. They did not bring it to you automatically. And that's because they realized that they had to do some conservation efforts in regards to the sustainability of that community.
It is, yes, which is why it's both immediate action and long-term. When I said there are, of all the things, you can throw money at stuff. We need to have outcomes that you are buying and the behavior change. And I hats off to Hayes. It's taken 20 years, as I understand, because I went out to talk with them. I'm like, tell me. And they're like, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes 20 years, and you have a lot of pushback at first. And so I think there's a state role and there's a local role, but it comes also down to Kansans and being willing to say, like, I'm not going to just get a glass of water because I think that's what I've always had. I'm going to ask for it if I want it. That's a simple example, but you play that out over and over again. It's a human behavior thing, too, and that's the hardest of all.
Questions for Julie Lorenz. Representative Sutton. Almost called you Secretary Lorenz again.
Good enough. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Glad you're here. And I can definitely see your handiwork in the designing of this. It's, as far as the comparison to the Ike plan. I like the agility that you're building into it. I'm a fan. I will forgive you the color coding of the barcodes, only because you did make a Peabody and Sherman reference, so that's okay. But a couple of questions I did have. It seems to me, and there were some hints at it, but we've got step 1, fund it, step 3, outcomes. That step 2 seems a little dicey. There are a few things outlined here, and that's great, but none of them really looked at the area where water was most scarce, and that it would be western Kansas. I see, the septic system replacement, some dredging in mostly the east side of the state.
So, yes, great question. I would have expected, if I'd left without a question from you, I would have been disappointed. I'm not now. So here's the thing. These are just snippets. So one of the outcomes, so in this framework, one of the outcomes, so for example, is on the aquifer side, on the conservation side, aquifer side, if you will. And it goes something like forgive me, I think it's like 18 million a year roughly. We would look at something like, 50,000 audits and the uptake of like 75,000 technology pieces, so to speak, like better pivots and whatnot, with the outcome being, over the next 10 years, a 15% reduction in water usage with no impact to profitability. So it's absolutely in there. I just didn't get to that one. I would also say, and I think Representative Rogers could have done the presentation for me. He's heard it so many times. But so it's in the framework. It's outlined in the framework of that would be accomplished. Another example, this is where it's tough work. I think that's why I think it's so fascinating. So when you think about incentivizing, so cost share is what we mean, that the state would provide part of the cost share, the feds might in some cases, so that you would use better technology, better pivots, soil probes, whatever. Now, here's where the tricky business starts to happen, is that What we need to make sure is what you're representing for taxpayers is you want a reduction in the use of water. What you can do is you can use that technology, continue to use the same amount of water, and produce more. So I think that's one of the questions, right, that is like to think about that. On behalf of taxpayers, maybe you're like, yeah, we want to underwrite, we'll help pay for the technology if we get the outcome we need as a state, which is less water usage. If you producer want to go use better technology and produce more, that's on you. So those are the sorts of things which can get to be a little uncomfortable, but those are the kinds of things we need to figure out because you want it to provide cost share to get the outcomes the state needs, not necessarily the individual producer. And so those are the things that we have to think through. So that's an example.
Excellent.
Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Also, no, I didn't wear my glasses, so I'm having to hold this quite a ways away from me here on page 21. Secure water sources for vulnerable communities. Are you recommending the state purchase 8,000 acres of land, 8,000 more acres of land? That's what it looks like. Purchase 8,250 acre feet of water rights. Sorry, my bad. I read that incorrectly.
No. So the thought here would be around instead provide grants to communities. Communities can then negotiate water rights better, I think, than the state can. And we would do that through a process. Again, this gets back to this like building regional plans, project pipelines, understanding which communities are sort of at most dire need and where do they, if they need assistance in finding water rights. It's not a come one, come all kind of thing. That's why we need to do this prioritization. All right. And one other,
real quick.
One more if I'm quick. Okay. Under the stockwater system upgrades, add 4 feedlots receiving grants. Okay, what are they doing? What's this? What are we granting exactly?
I am so glad that Earl's here, or someone. But essentially, it's the stockwater is instead of like having it just splash out on the ground, capture that and recycle it.
Excellent. All right.
I mean, that's like, if that's way wrong, Earl, I'd just say that's how I would say it.
And then we'll have one final question, then we do need to get up to the floor, and so that'd be Representative Ousley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you. You stated something that I don't think I'd heard before in water discussions, in that so many municipalities were with one health violation or more. Can you just restate that?
So my understanding is 70,000 Kansans have water supplies that have had at least one health infraction. And then I would look to Leo. Well, all right, no Leo. Anyway, that's what I would like to do is put a pin in that and make sure that I have an act. That's like what my notes are, but let's get you a citation.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Lawrence, for being here, and thank you for letting me change the agenda up and then have you last, because obviously water is going to be something that we're going to be having a long-term discussion on. So committee, we are not scheduled to meet again until Tuesday at 9 a.m. So until then, we are adjourned.